Question for people in the congregation. What was happening in the lives of the Israelites at the time that Isaiah wrote in Isaiah 55? Joan, you better not answer this because you probably know. See whether others can think. Because there were three phases in the writings of Isaiah, wasn't it? Do you remember what the first phase was? Yep, true. But for the Israelites at the time, they went into bondage, into captivity. So that was the beginning of Isaiah. And at the end of Isaiah, it talks about them having returned to Israel from exile. So have a guess what happened in the middle. Any thoughts? Huh? Problems. Well, yes. 55 is the beginning of the next section where they're actually about to return. And the reason why they're about to turn is the Assyrians about to come and take over the whole show. And the Assyrians didn't have the same policy of keeping people in exile, so it meant that they could go home. So the geopolitical situation was changing, which meant that they could think about going home. So this is a message of hope written to them as they are thinking about going back to Israel and leaving the situation in which they were in. So the words of the reading, speaking of labouring for things that do not satisfy, seek the Lord while he is to be found, are talking about the thinking about and that journey of going on and what they might do within that. Now, I think at a number of levels, we could probably identify with that situation. Now, are we in post-COVID or are we in later COVID? Whatever we're in at the moment, it's different from what the last 2 years have been. But it's not back to normal, is it? And that's probably what they were thinking and finding, certainly when they got home in later Isaiah, that it wasn't just going back to the way things were. And for us, things may never get back to what they were in all sorts of ways. We had a really good presbytery meeting yesterday. Was yours good?
At least you were there, and David, and I.
Because we were talking about the annual report. Now, Graham's done our annual report. I don't know whether BlackRock have done theirs yet. I've got to write mine. It's time to do it. The annual report was a really good one because it not only talked about what had happened in the last year, it was also talking about what was to happen next year, what the plans were, what the thinking was. And we had some really good discussion around what was important for the life of the church. And we had some breakout groups to talk about that. And the suggestion of things like our mission and the new faith communities, helping the church with the legal things that we've got to comply with nowadays. There was a number of things that were talked about as being important issues for the life of the presbytery. But in the small group that I was in, as we talked about this, someone suggested that those things are important, but the most important thing before all that is if we don't reach out to young people and start to develop a stronger connection with some younger people than us, at whatever age we are, then we're not going to be here in the future in the way that we are. So we talked about a little bit about that being a primary issue and how we might do that. And the importance of actually reaching out and connecting and getting to know people. And the attitude that we go with to connect with them. Now, we did a little bit of work on this. The people who were in the mission pilot process from Cheltenham, Mentone, did a little bit of work on this. And we had a thing that was talking about the way that we're with people. We can be with people. We can do things for people. We can do things with people, or we can be with people, being present with people. And what we're suggesting was that sometimes we get caught up in doing the things that we do, but we don't always make the time to develop the connections and relationships with the people that we're with. It's about being present, which is some weeks ago when I last did a physical sermon in this place, that was what I was talking about. So the fruit that is talked about in Isaiah, the thing that satisfies is that connection with God, which is about relationship. It's about listening to the call of God and those things that deeply sustain us, which, as the Isaiah prophet writes here, the things of God aren't always the same as the things that we think, are they? That's why it's important for us to be able to, what's God saying to us, to listen to that. But the hardest thing to listen is actually if we think we already know. Now, when you need to work something out, in the old days, how did you do it? If there was something you didn't know, how did you do it? If you wanted to work out how to plant a passion fruit tree, how would you do it? Look in a book. Ask someone who had done it, right. The other thing we talked about is in developing relationships with people, it's really good for two people to be able to talk. Because sometimes when we try to develop a relationship with someone, we actually find that they're much more interested in telling you what they think and their experience, less interested in listening to yours. And sometimes they'll listen to yours just enough to be able to respond back of why they think that's not a good idea. I was always impressed with the people who, even if they disagreed with you, they might say, tell us a bit more about that. Ask a bit deeper, rather than just coming out with a statement of why they think it's wrong. That's about making connection. And that's what we talked about yesterday, of how we connect with young people. So the skills of actually connecting are things we need to do. But the other thing is really important, is we need to be close enough to God to be able to reflect some of that light. The discipleship, the connection with God, the everyday walk with God, where we are trusting God day by day and learning how God speaks to us. Learning to recognise the way God speaks to us and to respond to that. What we were talking about yesterday was the danger is we become focused on the important thing is being together, and particularly at a time where people and dollar resources get tighter, we focus on keeping going. But the danger is we actually miss the opportunities that God is calling us to do something different. Now, I want to tell you about the sermon I wrote on Friday. I use an application called MindNode, which allows you to have thoughts, write thoughts down, and you have branches coming off rather than writing a script. On Friday, I made my additions to what I had, and I thought, yep, I reckon that'll be good. I opened up my iPad this morning to look at it again, just to refresh this morning before breakfast. Friday's notes weren't there. I went the changes. I thought, had I saved it? Whoa. When I went to, because it was saved in the cloud. When I went to my laptop, I opened it up and they were there, and I thought, isn't that really good? And then they disappeared from my eyes. So whatever had happened, the notes from Friday disappeared, and I thought, goodness me, what's Di's phone number? And then I thought, those words from Isaiah, your thoughts are not my thoughts. And I thought, okay, maybe there's something different I need to say today than what I thought I needed to say on Friday, which was helpful for me on Friday. If I ever find it, I might share it with you. But it's being open to the opportunities and to see maybe there's something different. And this had some different thoughts this morning and made some notes that were different to what I had on Friday, and particularly because of the experience yesterday. What's the different thing that God's calling us to? What's the different type of fruit that God is looking for us to engage in? In our annual reports, what is the thing we'll be saying we'll be doing in the next 12 months? There's been times where I've thought about that and I've just found it too hard. head hurts in the current time. And yet, in this time, when things aren't normal, there's actually an opportunity to see something differently, to get to know some different people, to think about how we might do things differently, how God is calling us to reach out to people in a different way, to see things in a different mindset. Now, in the gospel reading, that's what Jesus was actually saying to the people. Their understanding at the time was, if something bad happened, then you must have done something to deserve that. And that's something that is very easy for us to fall into that pattern for a whole lot of reasons. I was reading Bill Loader's commentary on that passage, and he made an interesting comment. He said that this passage, which was the passage of the tower and then of the fig tree, but particularly of the towers, Jesus' own story contradicts these theologies, he writes. The cross came to the righteous one. So if you're saying that something bad happening is because of sin, then how does that work with Jesus' life? He then goes on to say that one of the ways of understanding what happened on Easter and Good Friday, this is not a spoiler alert, it's just a different way of thinking as we prepare, is a lot of times we think of Easter Sunday as turning around and validating what Jesus said and did, and it's God's victory over the attempt to get rid of God from the world, in a sense. But Bill says there is an alternative approach, to see the resurrection not as the reversal, but as the affirmation of the crucifixion. This love and vulnerability is God's way. It's not an exception to God's way, an interim stunt that had to be reversed. This is life, and paradoxically, only by affirming it do we find life. It's actually the humility and willingness to make the journey, God's willingness to humble, and the cost for us and for us to be incorporated into God and to receive the Spirit and relationship with God in a new way because of that. God's ways are not our ways. So what is it? What is that new that God is calling us to do? What's the fruit that God's wanting us to live out? And how will we respond to that call? Now, I had a picture to show you to finish. And Sandra, we might, make it full screen. You remember this from a couple of weeks ago. If you weren't, I was talking about jigsaws a few weeks ago in a children's thing. And this was the jigsaw that Judy and Rebecca were working on. And we talked about jigsaws. Now, the next picture shows it's finished, but do you notice what's up the top? The box was wrong. It was a 1,001 piece jigsaw, but the one had nowhere to go. So I've had much more experience of finding a piece missing than an extra piece in a jigsaw. You could spend a long time with that one piece trying to find out where it goes before you were finished without realising it doesn't really belong in this picture. Some of the things that we stress and strain over aren't really part of the picture that God wants for the future to be the most important thing, the fruit that we need to be working at. So we need to come to the waters for our thirst for God and God's ways so that we might drink and be refreshed.